Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, how are you doing?
How's Nick? Welcome back from the US. Glad to see you made it back in one piece.
Yeah, despite the best efforts of Delta Airlines. Also joined today by Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Nick. And I was going to echo Marius's comment. We're glad to see you, but it's a pity we can't see you. I believe you're having load shedding.
Yes,
and
not load shedding. Internet problems today,
right,
unfortunately, which are I've had it up to here with internet service providers, but anyway. Also, just a quick programming note. Yeah, no,
glad to be with you. I certainly endorse Marius thing. Yeah.
glad to be here in voice, if not in face. Just a quick programming note: there will not be a show on Wednesday at 1:30. Instead, there will be our shorter version of the Daily Friend Show, the Daily Friend Wrap. There will be an episode of that which will come out at about 5 o'clock. And that show is not recorded live, but it will be sort of premiered live. So have a look out for that. And that'll be the norm kind of going forward, at least for now. We're going to be shaking up our programming a little bit on the Daily Friend Show, trying out some new things. So without any further interruption, let's start off with our story today. And this is from one of South Africa's most, I think, charismatic and forthright CEOs, and that is Neal Froneman of Sibanye-Stillwater, who says that Sibanye-Stillwater is going to be taking down criminal kingpins, and ideally he would like to have government's help. But as far as he's concerned, they're going to go ahead without state help if they have to. He gave an interview and he announced an initiative between Sibanye-Stillwater and Remgro, who say that they are currently launching a joint business government initiative against crime and corruption, and that if government doesn't play ball, they'll set their own priorities if there are any attempts to stonewall them. He said, quote, "We are very aware that certain elements may try to stonewall us, but we're designing our crime and corruption initiative so that we can achieve 80% of our aims alone." He says that the initiative of this is to disrupt criminal supply chains, and that the larger companies have actually got pretty good crime intelligence. They know who the kingpins are behind major crime syndicates. He says, until now, the private sector has been sending crime intelligence reports to police and nothing has happened. We know who they are and we will disrupt them. We will chop them off at their knees. It's now got to such a crisis where the state has become so weak that business in every respect, not just with regards to crime and corruption, has no choice. We've reached a tipping point, whether it's the area of energy, transport, and logistics, or crime and corruption. We are stepping up and we're going to make a difference with or without government. He said that civil society needs to step up, run municipalities, fix infrastructure, because it's hopeless to wait for government to do it. He also said that that government had been offered, particularly with regards to the National Prosecuting Authority, extra capacity by various large companies who said that they would help pay for basically anything that would help tackle corruption, anything from lawyers to various costs, and that this had all been rejected. He was asked in this interview whether this would help government if business suddenly started taking up the slack and covering for government. He said, "I fully understand they will use this politically to suit themselves, but I think civil society will see right through it. From the polls I've seen, what we're doing is not going to be interpreted as the government suddenly having done something. The government is seen as weak and voters will vote in a much more objective way. I don't think we're going to do anything that's going to distort voters' feelings about the government. They are deeply depressed like all of us and will vote correctly. I don't think we want to watch it all go down the drain, which is what will happen if we do nothing." Michael, what do you make of Froneman's comments?
Yeah, I mean, fighting talk indeed. He's certainly lived up to his reputation as being somebody who tells it like it is. I think that's very healthy. I liked some of the sentiments right down at the bottom of the story. He referring to Yanni Durant, the CEO of Remgro, with whom he's working on this project, the kind of crime initiative partnership with the government, that Durant and I are both very competitive. We don't want to waste our time, and we're not going to waste our time. So that kind of does seem to signal a very purposeful, business-like approach to this problem. But I especially liked the very final sentiment here is that, we're referring to ministers and officials. They're not our friends, he says. They are our working partners. And they must do their job, and we'll do our job. And if they don't, they will be called to task. So it sets up a very very clear sort of paradigm of how they intend to approach this. And what it also does, I think, is sets up in the public mind how the terms on which we are to judge businesses in willingness to work with the government. I think that's quite an important thing. It's potentially a risk for both of them. I think for business generally, they will be seen to represent the private sector and corporate South Africa. And they're saying, we are going to act, we're going to take out the criminals at the knees and all the rest of it. But if they don't, it's likely that they will come under very significant pressure, very great scrutiny or greater scrutiny. I think he's certainly right to say that if we're going to survive as a country, we cannot rely on some kind of reform mindedness to suddenly form in the ANC's mind, let alone in its actions. So I think it's a kind of honest, very frank appraisal of where we stand, and let's hope that it is actually an indication of where we go from here. Whether that it is in fact going to deliver the results that he seems to suggest he's determined to achieve.
Yeah, I really wish that more of business would sound like this. And this is not a new thing. What are they called? Neal Froneman has been kind of at the forefront of criticizing government and being fairly blunt for quite a while now. So this is no surprise coming from him. But I really like his call for civil society to be more active. And to engage more in this. And I kind of like the fact that he sort of says that, he thinks that there will be political change. And I think there's a version of wanting the government or civil society to step up and fill the role of government, which kind of is a bit naive in that it thinks it kind of almost views the state as becoming completely irrelevant. And therefore the private sector will be able to run everything, and then the country will be some kind of sort of libertarian paradise. But the state's not going to go anywhere.
No.
Even in a country as dysfunctional as DRC, the state is still able to extract resources from the from people who are actually producing things, making stuff. So kind of without improving the state in some way, it's always going to remain this kind of lodestone around the country's neck. Even if you can kind of stabilize the ship by civil society becoming more active.
Yeah, and there tends to be this. I like that word, naive. Sorry, I'm butting in here briefly, but this notion that is very popular among people who'll say, "Well, politicians are a waste of time, and we can get by without them." Well, actually, we can't, for exactly the reasons that you said. That the state is managed by elected officials. That's just how it is, and it's how it should be. And people should be focusing on making political choices. And as you say, it's very good that Froneman addresses directly. He anticipates people thinking differently about how they vote, and that that electoral process is central to how the state functions.
I think Froneman may have somewhat tipped his political leanings when he suggested that the people will, quote, vote correctly.
I saw that.
Marius, what do you make of all this?
Yeah, I think, it doesn't surprise me that Neal Froneman is saying this kind of stuff. He's been, it seems to be kind of the consensus now that the government is doing very badly. But, and with many people coming out and saying these kinds of things, but Neal Froneman's he was almost a lone voice, especially amongst business leaders in South Africa. We've seen some people like Magda Verchishka, who, she was one of the biggest supporters of Cyril Ramaphosa in 2018, 2019. She's now said I mean, I think she's even saying some things that are, a bit that aren't completely correct about the state of the country. So I think a lot of people, so Neal Froneman, I don't think he's saying anything that many people are disagreeing with, but I think he's been one of the few people who has called it as it is. I think he's been quite a brave figure in calling out what's been happening in South Africa. And I think it's, I think we actually need more of this, but I think we're seeing a lot of this now. And this, it does seem that, from the business leaders who were pretty quiet before, are starting to say things. We've seen, for example, Business Leadership South Africa, Busi Mavuso, she came out recently. I mean, she's been criticizing Eskom, she criticized the NHR, and a lot of other organizations, or, business leaders and so on are coming out and actually, putting in the ANC on notice, and a lot of other people who have influence in these kind of circles, Peter Bruce and so on. So I think Neal Froneman is a bit of a Cassandra, I think, because he was telling us what was going to happen. I think almost like the Institute of Race Relations itself, but Cassandra-ish, been warning people what's going to happen. Nobody wanted to listen. And then all the things that we've predicted would happen are coming to pass. So, but I think it's quite interesting how Neal Froneman has said that going to sort of bypass the state. And as you say, Nick, that's not really feasible. And I'm open to correction, but I do think Neal Froneman even said a few years ago, where in the mines where in the towns and so on where Sibanye-Stillwater operates, a lot of the functions of the state are actually taken over then by the mine, providing electricity and water and so on. And then when these things fail, then people go and protest outside the mine instead of outside the city hall or whatever the case is. So in people's minds, becomes the mine who's now responsible for these kinds of services, and the state kind of washes hands of it. But as you say, like in the DRC, it's still extracting rents and resources and taxes from the producers without actually providing anything. And I think the DRC is a very good example. It's been, since for many years, the DRC has been like that. From also when Mobutu was still in charge from the 1970s and so on. And I think, South Africa must be careful of not becoming a kind of a DRC state. I like to maybe, instead of developmental state, to talk about the parasite state or the vampire state, which extracts resources and goods and so on without giving anything back in return.
Speaking of vampire states, let's move on to our next topic for today. And there is a lot of praise at the moment for the new president of Nigeria. President Tinubu recently won election in I think it was a three-way contest that was pretty hotly contested in Nigeria. There were, as there always is in Nigeria, claims of vote rigging and manipulation of the polls and that kind of thing. I don't know to what extent that is true. But regardless, he did come to power without too much sort of violence or chaos breaking out in the country. And he is receiving praise for the speed at which he is engaging in various reforms to improve the economy of Nigeria. And Michael Avery, writing in, I think it was Business Day, says that he shows up how much Cyril Ramaphosa did this. Nigeria is, I would say, inarguably a harder place to govern than South Africa. As difficult as South Africa is to govern, Nigeria is much more complicated and much harder. And yet, President Tinubu appears to have been making some reforms that the business sector across the world thinks is positive. Marius, what do you take from this?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. And Nigeria, I think, is kind of the sleeping giant of Africa. It's already, depending how you measure it, I think it's got a bigger economy than ours. I think we're the third biggest economy in Africa now after Egypt and Nigeria. They've also got, very big population. I think it's about 250 million people. And Nigerians also, I mean, you obviously don't want to stereotype, they're quite hardworking people and so on. I know in the United States, Nigerian Americans are often at the top of the rankings of how much people earn and so on. So, Nigeria, I think, as I said, it's really the sleeping giant of Africa. And if they can get things right over there, they could really take off and be the real superpower in Africa. But as I said, I think it's a very difficult place to govern. I mean, it's got far more languages than South Africa has. It's also got the cleavages of Muslims and Christians. It's also got some secessionist groups. I mean, it had a civil war in the late 1960s when the Biafrans tried to secede. And I think there is still that kind of sentiment in Biafra and other parts of Nigeria too. And I think it just shows us South Africa is getting left behind more and more. There was another article of the weekend by Tyler Cowen, who's an American economist, and he was just saying, the country in Africa where you want to invest at the moment is Kenya. So he brought up Nigeria and South Africa and Ethiopia. But he, as you said, they've all got different problems, but all do have quite serious problems. So I think South Africa is definitely getting left behind. We have Nigeria, we have Kenya. There's a lot of other countries that are already starting to get things right. Even Angola seems to be, sort of getting onto the right path. It's starting to crack down on corruption. It's doing things like letting the currency be free floating and so on, and not be managed. So, and I think South Africa's we just gonna, we're going to make mistakes that other African countries have made in the past 30 or 40 years, but just repeat those mistakes before we actually start reforming properly and, getting the and getting this potential that we actually have in South Africa, actually finally harnessing it. And as we all know, that South Africa has got this great potential, but just pity about the government.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, Nigeria, it always amazes me that it has this enormous population of about, I think it's 220 million now, estimated. Something like a fifth of Africa lives in Nigeria. And it has for so many years been kind of in many ways the poster child of what we might call that vampire state, with this incredibly dysfunctional government, but that one that survives and continues to be sort of influential by living off of oil revenue, which Nigeria has for many years. But, as you say, if there's positive political reform there, Nigeria's potential to sort of take off and really leave South Africa in the dust is, I think, quite startling. And as many countries around the world, such as China or India or even Indonesia to some degree, have proven, you don't actually have to have the full raft of sort of functioning free society tech check boxes in order to actually start making significant economic and prosperity progress. Michael, what do you make of this?
I think your last point is a very good one. You've got to get some essentials going, and I think it creates momentum. It creates the kind of direction of movement that you want, and you build on that. And as we've said, I think often on the show, none of this is rocket science. Michael Avery in his column sums up the sort of Nigerian approach crisply when he says that Tinubu set about implementing a program of reform that essentially centered on diagnosing what needed to change. That's a very basic thing. Here in this country, we have excellent think tanks like the IRR, but other people looking at this constantly, experts in education, in the economy, in mining, in services, and so on. So the information is there, the data is there, the advice is there, the options are there. You focus on what needs to change. You work with the private sector and communicate it broadly with the public sector and the cabinet. And so you get this kind of sense of people all working in the same direction. You build an army of allies, is quite a nice phrase that Avery uses, in implementing the reforms. And by linking performance to improved pay, and not the other way around, this is a big problem that we often face, and then zero tolerance for corruption. But these are not difficult things to do. They're simply things that require clear thinking, an ability to get people to sign on, to coalesce around these very basic ideas, and then you have action. Get people to actually act on what it is that you're expecting them to act on. And I think once you start getting that going, even in those small areas, as you say, you don't need to fix the whole range of or be guaranteed the whole range of sort of a free market constitutional democratic dispensation going simultaneously. You start with whatever you can start with immediately, and you build on that, and you link them all together. And I think in that way you can generate a movement for change, and that appears to be what Nigeria is succeeding in doing. And there's no reason why we can't do the same.
It is also worth pointing out that Nigeria has famously had electricity problems, I think, for decades. Basically, its own kind of load shedding. But I was just looking this up now. Outside of the capital, Nigeria seems to have on average kind of 17 to 18 hours of electricity a day, which, when we're in stage 6 is actually better than us. they seem to be making some progress. Any final thoughts, Marius, before we move on?
I see there's some comments about Namibia in the YouTube comments here. I'm not too sure if I'm as bullish on Namibia. I was speaking to a Namibian economist a little while ago, and while their economy is growing much faster than South Africa's, they're growing about 3% a year compared to our basically 0%. They also have quite a few problems there, whereas a designated employer in South Africa is somebody with more than 50 employees. In Namibia, apparently it's more than 10. So if you employ more than 10 people, you've got to follow various BE laws. They also have ramblings about EWC and all this kind of thing. There's also a bit of some quite radical elements there who want to, kind of nationalize all land and so on. And also the fact this economist I was speaking to was saying the fact that the Namibian dollar is pegged on a one-to-one basis to the rand is actually a bit of a problem. He, in his opinion, he thought the Namibian dollar needs to be a little bit weaker. And that's actually a bit of a break on the Namibian economy. And just, finally, just from a absolute point of view, they've only got about 2 million people. They've got as many people as Joburg has. Sorry, not even. About half as many people as Joburg has. So just from that kind of point of view, I think there's a sort of a cap on the potential Namibia has. And of course, it's we've seen that it does have, it's got lots of the same kinds of advantages South Africa has. I think a fairly educated population, decent infrastructure, and there's got, I think there's, I'm not sure if it has been discovered, I think there might be quite a lot of oil off the Namibian coast and gas and so on. So it's definitely a place I think to look out for, but I'm not sure if it's, it's got quite the potential of somewhere such as Kenya or Nigeria, but it's definitely some place to watch. And I think probably a lot of South Africans consider Namibia as a bit of a bolt hold if things do start going pear in South Africa, if we do get President Julius Malema next year.
Yeah, I do think that human capital is sometimes undervalued, or at least just sheer population size is sometimes undervalued by some economic analysis as to how much it can really increase the dynamism of your society. And I think it really is difficult to, even when you've got things going well, as a country like, Botswana does have things that we don't like in its economic policy, and I know it's quite restrictive on foreigners, for example, and that kind of thing. But it's been generally run reasonably well for a long time, and yet it's still just not like an economic powerhouse. And I think that's just basically because it's got too few people. And I think Namibia is always going to have that problem too.
Botswana's got big problems when the diamonds run out. They've been trying to diversify, but they haven't really managed to. And also, there does seem that the government is becoming a bit more strict on civil and other political liberties and so on. So
right.
Botswana is also a place to, I think, be a little bit concerned about. Obviously, it's working pretty well, but I think the future could be a bit rough.
Right, and I think it's no surprise then that the sort of major emerging huge economies of the 21st century, particularly in Asia, India, China, Indonesia, all have very big populations. I think it definitely does add to that.
And also, the issue of growing population. This is why 21st century will be the Indian century, not the Chinese century, because China's population is shrinking. They're only going to about 700 million people by the middle of the century, whereas India's population is growing and it's much younger. Far more people in India are under the age of 30 than in China. So that's also a big benefit for India compared to China.
Yeah, even though they have a long way to go still in catching up to China, I think they're making incredible progress. All right, well, let's move on to I think this is maybe our last story or second last story. And the electricity minister, Ramakgopa, I think he's been pretty active in the media. He's certainly given us a lot of things to talk about, including infamously his "corruption's not really the problem" quote, which is sort of true, but also sort of not true at all. But anyway, he has been talking a little bit about drawing up a new plan to have more private sector input in building generation capacity for the grid. This does actually run contrary to, I think, what Minister Gwede has suggested at various times, which is that we can just fix the coal-powered fleet and then that'll be fine. Ramakgopa seems to be taking a different approach, which is that we really do actually need new power plants, which I think is not particularly controversial. amongst people who pay attention to this stuff. He says that he would like to involve the private sector, and he's working on a model which would see the private sector finance, build, and operate electricity products for a short amount of time before transferring it back to government control, presumably back to Eskom. He also says that the issue of tariffs is going to be important because you do not want energy to be unaffordable or to be exclusive domain of the affluent and the rich, undermining our ability for universal access of connecting the poor onto the grid. So you can see the complexity of this equation. There are multiple variables that require attention. So there's definitely something in this that sounds reasonable, right? Getting the private sector to build and operate power stations sounds like a good idea. Here's the devil in the detail here, which is he says short period before transferring it back to government. I don't really know why it necessarily needs to go back to government. I mean, apart from the fact that he's ideologically captured by the state-centric worldview. But this is going to be the real sticking point. What company in their right mind would say, yeah, no, sure, we'll build your new power plant, your new nuclear power plant, your new wind farm. We'll put all of our money and risk into building it. We'll run it for 2 years and then hand it back to government. I think he needs to be very careful with this whole short period. Otherwise, no one in the private sector is going to come to the table, I don't think. Michael, what do you make of this?
I think that's exactly right. We saw a similar thing, I think, with the attempts to get the private sector interested in the rail. It's a very good idea in principle. But the early ones, and I'm not sure, I think there was some sort of late development of that score, but some of the early attempts to encourage investment in two of the big routes, I think Gauteng to Durban to KZN, and another one in the Eastern Cape, they'd set such a short time scale for such a project that it simply wasn't viable financially or commercially, and there weren't any takers for at least one of them. I can't quite remember now if that was actually altered and they had some further success, but clearly, there has to be a good dose of realism with any of these kinds of things, thinking in terms of partnering with the private sector, which I think is a good thing. There's a lot that can be done, both with electricity, with schooling, with healthcare, right across the economy, I think. But it must be based on a kind of thoroughly practical, realistic schema that people understand. How much needs to be invested, and what it's going to take to attract that investment, which is a workable plan essentially. But a short period, as you say, that doesn't sound really appealing at all, or wouldn't sound appealing to investors.
And Marius, I think this is really where we see how ideology is the central problem in policy reform in South Africa. Here, we see the slightly more pragmatic arm of government saying, okay, fine. Everything is going wrong. You've twisted our arm enough. We'll let the private sector do something. But only under the condition that we ultimately reap all of the benefits, get to take full control of it in the end, and they have to put up all the risk. It's as long as you just keep thinking that the government ultimately has to be the final solution for all of these problems, there's not going to be any real progress, I think, in fixing South Africa's issues.
Yeah, I think that's it exactly. As Andre de Ruyter said in his book, the ANC, senior people in the ANC are still going around calling each other comrades, and they're still stuck in this old, worldview. I think this is even why we have this ANC support of Russia, leaving aside all the other issues. I think to a large degree they still kind of think of Russia as the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union used to support the ANC in the struggle against apartheid. Therefore, they must still support Russia / the Soviet Union. And this is why we get this kind of stuff. As I say, the worldview, it's 60, 70 years out of date. And there's a battle now between ideology and reality. And thankfully, in a way, I think reality is starting to win. It doesn't always win. Ideology beat reality in Zimbabwe and Venezuela, for example, and we've seen the consequences there. And while I think there's a big struggle in South Africa between ideology and reality, reality sometimes has the upper hand, I think. And we're seeing in these, kind of the thin end of the wedge, like kind of allowing privatization, and it's just starting to get that the kind of pulling the first little thread on a jersey to start for the whole jersey starts sort of coming apart, and I think that's what we're seeing here. So yeah, I think it's. I mean, this is. I think it's actually pretty positive, and I think maybe the more ridiculous things, where the government would expect the power plant to be given over the day after it's been finished getting built or whatever the case is. But I know. I think maybe it's a good way of solving our electricity problems, but I think we've got a long way to go. And it seems like Ramakgopa is actually trying to do the right stuff a lot of the time. And maybe he wasn't the worst guy for this position. But I mean, as one of our writers in the Daily Friend, Jonathan Katzenellenbergen, said, when the Soviet Union ran out of vegetables, they appointed a minister of vegetables. And it's kind of the same thing in South Africa. Appoint a minister of electricity when you start to run out of electricity. So let's hope we never get a minister of oxygen or something like that in South Africa.
I do just want to make a final point here, which is that we sometimes use ideology as shorthand, but really what I mean when I say ideology is this sort of outdated 1970s Marxist claptrap, which kind of infests government. I consider myself a fairly ideological person in favor of free markets and liberal political institutions, and I think really the problem here is very specifically the ideological approach that government has taken, which is to always favor the state, to always centralize power, to always assume that problems are caused by saboteurs and not by its own failings. But anyway, we're out of time for today. So we hope that you found the show interesting. Just a reminder, there won't be the normal show on Wednesday. There will be the Daily Friend Wrap show in the evening, which will come out at around 5. So have a look out for that on the podcast apps and on YouTube. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Cheers, everyone. Have a good one.